why still read Thomas Aquinas today? There are several reasons to turn one's interest to somebody. For example, external occasions such as jubilees, birthdays, commemorative days, and this is where Thomas fits in. This year, the 750th commemorative day of his death, next year, the 800th birthday. But let me start with an observation. If you compare the celebration of these commemorative days, for example, with those 50 years ago in 1974, it's very characteristic that there seems to be not such an interest as it was 50 years ago. 50 years ago, you couldn't even avoid bumping into this jubilee stuff, which now covers mainly also the competition with Kant, at least in Germany, but even on the international level. I had the impression that it took some time, even until now, that the people discovered that one of the great minds, I guess, I have to say, has celebrating at least 2 of those jubilees in a sequence. Yeah. But let's move to internal occasions, which are much more interesting. So what should motivate us to read a 75-year-old thinker, or even an 800-year-old thinker? Yeah, okay, he is a classic, but when is somebody a classic, and what does this really mean? Yeah. There must be, therefore, something he has really to tell us in order to read him, in particular as philosophers. So my approach in this paper is, I will not discuss a specific research question, rather present a kind of a protrepticus domesticus, by highlighting some teaching which seem to have even today a great explicative power. But the fact that Thomas has something to say does not mean that he contributes to the neo-scholastic debates of today analytic philosophy. Reading Thomas does not mean measuring him against contemporary debates. Even it is worth taking note of his positions. Yeah? Rather, we must also engage with his otherness, which is not least due to the historical time gap. Enough with preliminary remarks. I have chosen 4 topics or cases for a fruitful and interesting encounter with Thomas' philosophical thinking. The first thing is the primacy of scientific reason. A small error at the beginning becomes a big one in the end. With this frequently quoted sentence, Thomas begins his treatise on being and essence, De Ente et Essentia, which he wrote as a young lecturer on theology in Paris in the early 50s of the 30th century. This programmatic sentence for Thomas does not refer to any kind of moral error, but to the fundamental epistemic question of what the mind first grasps. It's about the foundation and the elementary formation of our knowledge, from the ignorance of which no error may arise. But this question is not easy to answer. Rather, according to Thomas, the difficulties must be laid bare, and we must say what is meant by words essence and being, essentia and ens. What these words mean, and what is different, and how they relate to the logical order of species and genus. However, in order to be able to talk about what something is, we must first talk about what it means that there is something. Consequently, the realization that there is something precedes the investigation of that which we perceive is. Our certainty is based on this fundamental insight. We can call this the primacy of actuality. This primacy initially means that our attitude towards the world is fundamentally affirmative and relates affirmatively to what is. Our cognition is always based on the assumption that we want to recognize something, just as our actions always presuppose that we relate positively to something that is the objective and the goal of our actions. This basic attitude can easily be tested in our everyday lives. For example, when we go to the bakery in the morning to buy some bread for our breakfast rolls, or to take a cafe. This affirmative attitude includes the non-contradictory nature of our speech as well as the intended reference to the real existing world. In this context, logic speaks of validity and conclusiveness. A sentence is true if it is logically correct. That means free of contradictions and refers to something real. Not only our everyday experience is based on this assumption, but also our scientific attitude towards the world. Even those who strive for knowledge always want to recognize something and more. The pursuit of knowledge only comes to rest when something has been recognized in its essence. This also applies to the knowledge of God, and so Thomas' argumentation is always focused on clarifying the facts addressed in the respective question. This, however, is the task of science. The idea of science can be characterized as knowledge based on reasons that apply in a generally accepted and valid form for all participants in this discourse and establish a specific mode of knowledge that proceeds in a strictly argumentative manner. This initially applies independently of the respective model of science. Science always presupposes the idea of communication in the form of an argument. For Thomas, this idea of science is associated above all with Aristotle, whose writings were increasingly translated and distributed in the course of the so-called reception of Aristotle, together with the commentaries and writings of the Peripatetics, above all Averroes and Avicenna, from the middle of the 12th century onwards. Two of Aristotle's works in particular became decisive for our context: the Posterior Analytics, with its theory of science, and the Metaphysics, with its model of a first science. But for Thomas, science is also subject to an epistemic reservation that human reason is bounded reason, not absolute reason. At the beginning of his commentary on the Metaphysics, Thomas agrees with Aristotle's conviction that the universal truth of being, the universalis veritas entium, is determined from the perspective of how man relates to the truth to be recognized. This limitation on the part of our reason then leads to the realization that it is necessary for people to support each other in recognizing the truth, as no one is capable of doing this alone. On the one hand, this support takes place directly, when the predecessors have found something of the truth that leads the later ones to a greater realization of the truth, or indirectly, and in an indirect way, insofar as the earlier ones who were mistaken about the truth give the later ones the opportunity to practice, so that after thorough discussions the truth shows itself with greater clarity. That's the quote, end quote. From some of our predecessors, we would adopt the opinions on the truth of things, provided that in our opinion they have been well expressed, but we ignore other opinions. And those whose opinions we take up have other predecessors whose opinions they have accepted and who were the cause of their instruction. Thus, according to Thomas, there is a historical succession of those who have embarked on this search for truth. We are also part of this succession. Thomas shares this conviction of a strong connection of philosophy to its history with Aristotle, if one looks, for example, Metaphysics, Book A. Second topic, anthropology. I will talk about 5 underlying anthropological steps or important issues. The first one, it starts with a quote: "All humans naturally strive for knowledge." You always know it. That is a famous sentence of the opening of Aristotle's Metaphysics. Thomas is a great fan of this opening, and he quotes it everywhere. So the pursuit of knowledge is there presented as an ergon, peculiar to human beings, which is strongly connected to the question of human perfection. So this is the overall statement, And this is in particular linked when we talk about the ergon, we talk about the essence. We talk about what really humans' essence and understanding is about. One implication is, if you think about this, that there is no given limit for cognition and scientific knowledge regarding the objects of interest. For Thomas, the question of thought boundaries that should not be exceeded does not arise. So there is, when we discuss in contemporary discussions whether sciences should be allowed to do this, to think about this, Thomas would say, you can think about this, but it's impossible, man will do this for better and worse. So it is not a question of an epistemic status, maybe of a moral judgment. Yeah, but we have to take into consideration, and this is the overall experience, I guess, so in particular in the last years, when we look on the speed of progress in certain parts of sciences, that this confirms the sentence and this conviction that there is no given internal limitation unless we know everything what we are able to know. This also concerns our inclination to go for the absolute. But here indeed, and this is important, we come to a severe limitation in knowing the absolute, in knowing God. I will come back to this question later. Connected to this discovery of Aristotle and this famous sentence is a new positive view, that's my second point, of curiosity. You saw already that we did a Medievistentalung on this topic. A positive view of curiosity against the curiositas proviso of Augustine, who speaks of an empty and in vain curiosity if our striving for knowledge is disconnected to theology, the vera sapientia in his model, or the vera philosophia, and becomes disordered. So Augustine has a kind of a normative role, an understanding of a kind of a normative role of theology. For Thomas, humans remain curious as long as they did not find a definitive answer to a question which gives them the rest. Here he echoes Aristotle in Metaphysics Alpha, that the strongest motivation to strive for knowledge is to overcome one's own ignorance. This claim has epistemological as well as psychological and motivational consequences. It points to the intrinsic foundation, which is always prior and cannot be extinguished. And for this positive way of being curious, Thomas invents an academic virtue. I call it, this was a little bit my invention when I thought about it, the academic virtue of studiositas. Thomas always tries to be nice with Augustine, even if he criticizes him. So his way out is then that he invents this positive dimension of curiosity, and I call it the academic virtue of studiositas, so what we do, in our way. Third point. Anima est pura modo omnia. The soul is in a way everything. This is also a quote from Aristotle, third book of the Anima. And this quote from Aristotle points to the fact of the full intentional openness of the soul and of the mind. There is no reservation, no limitation according to possible objects of cognition, even not according with respect to the absolute. Rather, and this we have to take into consideration by the way how we perceive those objects. Let me underline again the affirmative attitude towards cognition. We want to recognize something as it actually is. We initially assume that the other person is telling the truth. We want a conservation to succeed. Cognizing and understanding takes place under conditions of success. This is the main, and this is also the way we talk about those things. If this doesn't happen, so we negate this, or we say this is false or an error, but we don't intend to achieve to some erroneous results, unless we take this as a very specific rhetorical strategy. But normally this is not our our inclination, our understanding. Fourth point, quid recipitur ad modum recipientis recipitur. Indeed, there is an epistemological proviso that what is received according to the way of the recipient. Yeah, and this is when we are talking about Kant, for example, as the one who puts metaphysics under an epistemological proviso. I think that he's not the first to say that what we consider to be metaphysics takes place under the conditions of the human intellect. Yeah, this is what for Thomas is absolutely in the center of his idea. So there is an epistemological proviso which has significant consequences when it comes to metaphysics, and metaphysics operates under this epistemological proviso. The peculiar reason for this is that human's ratio is bounded reason. So the human intellect is a ratio intellectus. Behind this is a classical two-story model of the intellect. Now, the discursive part of reasoning, the lower part, which gives us the categorical synthesis of what we perceive, and then the second part where we're talking about the principles which are able to synthesize even the categorical knowledge. So we have it from Aristotle. Also I was lucky to be able to participate in writing the article Vernunft, Verstand in the Historisches Wörterbuch der Philosophie. Maybe you know this Wörterbuch, Historische Wörterbuch der Philosophie. And so we studied the entire history of this, and very early in the history, this split between this two-stage model of reasoning comes up, where we have then dianoia and nous, and then ratio and intellectus. Yeah, Kant then switched it, Verstand, Vernunft. Yeah. So those are the two-story model. But for Thomas, it's absolutely clear that that man, the human intellect, is a ratio, not an intellectus. Yeah, and that means that a bounded reason under the conditions, yeah, of time and space and discursiveness and so on and so on. Yeah, and in this respect, this has also to do, but I cannot talk about this with hylomorphism and so on. But it's a great theory at least to my conviction. But what's important here is that man, as an animal rationale, yeah, as a rational animal, stands in the middle between the unreasoning living beings and the pure spiritual beings. But this is, for Thomas, an ontological constraint, so you cannot overstep it. Yeah, and for strengthening this argumentation, Thomas even quotes Dionysius the Areopagite and gives this qualification and ontological support. Yeah. The fifth point I will just mention and not elaborate here, that is man as an enlightened partner of the Creator, man's special responsibility for creation. This is very theological, and I'm not talking about Thomas as a theologian properly, but this is also a very substantial part of his anthropology. I have just to mention in order to present you Thomas, which is not reduced to a restricted model. Let me instead turn to the third topic. This is ethics. So let me underline first the importance of Thomas' ethics. I think that is between Aristotle and Kant the most important systematic approach of a moral philosophy or moral thinking as practical science. This is an extremely, still I think in many parts, Thomas also discovered or set the tone for further debates when we talk about the first systematic treatise on law, for example, and so on. But I will talk about ethics in a more general way. So, let me start with, by quoting the prologue of the Prima Secunde, that means the first part of the second part of the Summa Theologiae, where Thomas develops his systematic ethical approach. Human beings, as John of Damascus says, John the Damascene says, are made in the image of God, provided that by image is meant that which is intelligent and free in its decision and has power of itself. Therefore, after we have spoken in the foregoing about the archetype, namely God, and about that which has emerged from God's power according to his will, this was book 1, it remains now, second book, for us to consider God's image, humans insofar they too are the origin of their works. After all, they possess free decision and power over their work. So this is a very strong, powerful opening and sets the tone. This is, and the first thing is that it starts from the imago nature of the humans. Yeah, each human being is God's image in that he or she possesses reason and free will, and we have to read this as a strong parallelism, not just as a metaphor, rather as an analogy in the strong ontological sense. And this is what Thomas says, and when we just follow the keywords of this prologue. Yeah, and there are, in fact, 5 qualifications when we analyze it. And the first is intellectuale, being intelligent and endowed with reason. Second, arbitrio liberum, being free in the decision. Per se potestativum, powerful in itself. Suorum operum principium, origin of his/her works. And then the fifth ties some of those qualifications together. Liberum arbitrium habens et suorum operum potestatem, free decision and power over his works. So what Thomas aims is then, based on this, is a full display of a philosophical ethics whose proper object is the actus humanus, is the true human act, distinct from behavior. Yeah, also the actus humanus distinct from the actus hominis. This is a very important distinction. I come back to it. Let me highlight then in the following now 2 questions which are essential for philosophical ethics from this huge enterprise Thomas does. The first is related to the question, what does it mean to act freely? And second, how can we attain happiness? And both questions are deeply intertwined, and both questions are really essential for what Thomas thinks philosophical ethics has to be. First, what kind of freedom? Let me come back, and Pavel already pointed to De Malo 6, the Thomas' master argument in the 6th Quaestio Disputata De Malo, which is a very special question as such. It's a quaestio unica. So Thomas, I was also wondering, dealing with the complexity of this question, why didn't he split this question into articles as he does this in other places? But in fact, he didn't do this. He wanted to have it as a one unique argument, and it has also a very interesting outcome. The question starts with direct reference to Bishop Tampier's syllabus, quod voluntas hominis ex necessitate vultem eligit. And this gives, I think, the point. Yeah, it is what Thomas is here fighting. Yeah, is a kind of necessitarism, and which for him is the end and the closing of all kind of doing ethics and moral theology. So eligere is in the center of it. This is not will. This is eligere. Yeah, eligere, having the choice, deciding. Yeah, an action is not a necessary chain of events. It's rather contingent. Yeah, and what he makes clear, and this is even in the Summa at the very beginning, already in the first article of the first question, is the distinction between action and behavior. Yeah, ethics as a practical science is based on action and is based also on contingent matters. Yeah, and practical reason is clearly distinct from theoretical reason. That is then the consequence from this. Yeah, and Thomas tries, in De Malo 6, not only to defend the place of ethics as a practical philosophy, but also to defend the scientific character and the foundations of philosophy in general and of other sciences, such, for example, as physics, which results from the overstepping of one's own competencies. So what he's discussing in contemporary terms would be with physicalism and behaviorism. Yeah, those are the in contemporary terms the two objectives he is arguing against. And Thomas is following an anti-reductionist strategy and is looking for an irreducible criterion for free choice. And I will just concentrate on this point because it is the main point he makes in this Quaestio 6, De Libera Electione. Yeah. The point of departure, however, is a structural parallelism between inclination, appetite, and action in natural things and human beings. Quote, "For natural things have forms, which are the principle of action, and inclination resulting from the forms, which we call natural appetites, and actions result from these inclinations. Just so human beings have an intellectual form, a forma intellectiva, and an inclination of the will, resulting from the understood form, from the forma apprehensa, and external acts results from these inclinations." Nonetheless, the very same structural parallelism leads to a fundamental difference. While the form of a natural thing is a form individuated by matter, and therefore the inclination resulting from the form are determined to one thing, can be determined to one thing, determinata ad unum, the understood form. The forma intellecta is universal and includes many individual things, so qua multa possum comprehendi. Here a fundamental asymmetry between the acts regarding singular things arises, not one of them exhausts the potentiality of the universal, and therefore the inclination of the will remains indeterminately disposed to many things. Yeah, when we try to understand, imagine there are 50 glasses on this table of the same type filled with the same amount of water. What reason can you address to choose the one or the other? There is no choose, rather that you just take one. It is electio as this is a kind of an example to make this clear. This asymmetry that actions are contingent and singular, but intellectual perceptions and concepts is dealing with universals. Here, therefore, the inclination of the will remains indeterminately disposed to many things. Yeah, we can speak of a phenomenon of emergence insofar as a specifying criterion leads to a higher level, namely understanding, which cannot be deduced from a lower level, but has a strong impact on the lower level when reached. Hence, those higher level effects cannot be reduced to lower ones. So, reason here is the specifying criterion of action versus behavior, and functions as an interference of a causal process without the possibility to restore it. Yeah, this is always the claim if you go with the behavior of physicalistic argument, that there is a necessary chain of decision making, and for Thomas, the reason coming in interrupts this process, but it is impossible to restore it. So it marks a foundational difference of human acting as object of practical reason. In fact, the character of the human intellect, whose nature Thomas describes as discursive reasoning bound to abstraction, becomes a decisive specifying criterion. This causes a lasting asymmetry between the inclinatio ad unum of each single act and the intellectual representation of its object, which by its nature is universal and therefore indeterminately disposed to many things, not just to one. On the other hand, practical reason and choice are aligned at the single object which has to be decided on or which has to be chosen. Thomas gives the example of an architect who conceives the form of a house in general, under which different shapes of a house are included. His will can then be inclined to build a square house or a round house or a house of another shape. This is epistemic asymmetry and indeterminacy is irreducible and constitutes a fundamental difference between natural inclination, which always tends towards one particular thing, and rational or volitional inclination, which through the universal character of the intellect is always indeterminately disposed to many, remanet inclinatio voluntatis indeterminate se habens ad multa, says Thomas. This irreducible specific difference, which emerges from the underlying appetitive structure of agency, in its most general sense and served as a specifying principle of the proper human act, is the indeterminacy of the will as an appetitus rationalis or as a voluntas deliberata, an indeterminacy which cannot further reduce to any kind of natural or physical causality towards grasping the singular beyond the borders of universality. It is, properly speaking, not the strength of the will and its power to will, but its weakness, which stems from the characteristics of the intellect and its incapability regarding the understanding of the singular, that constitutes this kind of irreducible indeterminacy. And a brief supplement, the main qualification for having a choice or being able to choose is to know the object and to know the goal of the respective action. And this leads me to the second point. What does it mean having a goal? Yeah, an affirmative, it is first again the affirmative basic attitude. We act because of a goal, because we know the goal. Yeah, for Thomas, a positive goal and the knowledge of such a goal is required. We act in order to achieve a certain goal, on the condition that we can achieve it. Yeah, ethic. It has this has two inclinations or two implications. The first is very simple. If I wish to go to buy, let's see, a bottle of beer, I go to a store where I expect to get it. Yeah, and not to a place where I can buy shoes or T-shirts or whatsoever. The second thing is that this requires a sense of proportion. Only what is achievable, attainable, can serve as a goal for an action. There's a kind of a proportion between, and a sense of proportion between the goal to be achieved and the act to be executed. There's also something involved, and when we are talking about having a goal, the question of teleology fits in, and which is often treated nowadays critically. But I will make three arguments in favor of it, which then leads to the eudaimonia question, the second question in this field of ethics. I think the first thing I have already mentioned, having or knowing a goal is the main qualification for an action you are responsible for. Thomas always makes the claim between, for example, an animal that just functions and operates on the way of his biological inclinations, but does not know what the animal, what it does. And quite the opposite for man. This is the main criterion, knowing the goal, that we can talk about an action and deliberate action. Second, point is that teleology helps us to understand ethical decision making not just as a particular isolated act on isolated cases, but as part of a sequence of actions as well, which might become important for the singular action, decision, or choice to be made in a certain situation. So, for my students, I always say that you are in the class is not maybe is motivated also, and it will be a difference if you are sitting in the class, which is obligatory for reaching the semester goal or just for fun. When it comes to nice weather, you will go outside and sit in the sun and go to the swimming pool instead of sitting in my class. But when it comes to the point that you really need this class in order to fulfill what you have to do for your studies, because you want to finish your bachelor or your master, because you want to move to the next step in your life. So insofar, yeah, theology helps us. And sometimes, often in contemporary ethics, I see this reduction to decision making based on a single isolated act. You can do this, but you have to acknowledge that there might be a context, yeah, which is absolutely important how you decide in a certain situation. And finally. Ethics, for Thomas at least, has to do with an understanding of one's life as a life plan whose overall meaning is revealed from the end. So we have to take into consideration the life as a whole. And this is always, insofar Thomas is typical Aristotelian. This is an essential part for an ethics that you talk about. The final goal of your life, that you talk about the perfection of your life, that you talk about, yeah, eudaimonia, the beatitude, and this is the final goal, and this is and ethics without treating this question is incomplete for Aristotle as well as for Thomas Aquinas. But on the other hand, eudaimonia implies a certain point which relates or brings us back to the Malus 6, because eudaimonia is that which no human being cannot want, Thomas says. And I will just mention the implication. The implication for the Malus 6 is if this does not imply then a kind of necessity in decision making, so that the whole argument collapses. Thomas solves the problem in distinguishing between this practical conviction that no human being cannot want beatitude or eudaimonia in the way how we attain it, and he says that this knowing the fact that we are having a kind of a necessary choice with respect to that we attain and want to have eudaimonia does not mean that we know from this can be deduced how we reach it. So there is a certain kind of plurality of ways to attain and to achieve eudaimonia. Eudaimonia means that as I already say, that the ethics points to an ethics that considers not only individual decisions but a successful life as a whole. And the question how we can attain happiness is a question that is it leads Tom is a question that points to an Aristotelian dilemma. Yeah, and the Aristotelian dilemma and the Thomasian solution points to the question is to be said with respect to the happiness to be achieved in this life. But happiness, for example, in Aristotle, as you know, is more or less, I think, an overall fitness of the species of human beings. So there are the philosophers, they can attain it, but the others not. So I always say, I did discuss this once with my colleague Jan Opsomer, who is a great ancient philosopher, and say, I have the impression that for Aristotle, he doesn't care about all the individuals, but the overall fitness of the species must be reached as we find it in nature. Yeah, there is a tree. He has thousands of semens, but one semen has to survive in order to preserve the species of the thing. For Thomas, this is not acceptable. Yeah, for Thomas, we get happiness. He raises and emphasizes the happiness of the individual person. So what fits in here is the first person perspective through which Thomas addresses the question of eudaimonia. For Thomas, happiness is about the attainability of an ideal formulated in the concept of bliss of every human being. For every human being strives by nature for the highest realization of what she is by nature. And in this respect, yeah, humans are no different from any other living beings, but we have to understand the answer. Yeah, Thomas, and he understands, he sees here a real problem in Aristotelian theory and tries to get an answer. Yeah, the ideal forms the starting point and the center of Thomas' reflections, although this problem forms the starting point and center of Thomas' reflections in the third book of his Summa Contra Gentiles. And here, Thomas encounters a disturbing borderline experience. Humans cannot achieve by their own efforts what they desire in their innermost being. So for Thomas, this ideal is a speculative ideal giving theoria the preference, and as rational beings, humans naturally strive for perfect knowledge. The dynamics of the pursuit of knowledge arises from this. However, this desire to fully and completely comprehend experienced reality remains unfulfilled in one essential respect. Instead, humans find themselves restless on the path, constantly searching, with no chance to reaching this goal and coming to the rest there. And this seems to many, even the most outstanding minds, to be a depressing prospect. And Thomas speaks here in a very personal way. But he does not draw the conclusion that such perfect realization is impossible. Yeah? This would basically be completely against the nature of humans, and would ultimately make all our striving pointless and futile. For we can only really understand our lives as a whole in the light of the ultimate goal. However, we must not set this goal too narrowly. It is not to be found in this life, but in the union with the divine after this life, in the essential vision of God. Thomas is here really clear. He leaves it a convenience argument for the probability of a goal to escape the dilemma set up in Aristotle. He indicates the limitation of philosophy and the need for switching to theology. This is indeed that the answer of Thomas gives at the end. Yeah, is when you read, for example, chapter 48. At the end, he gives 3 quotes from the Bible and say, this is the only answer I can give you. I can show as a philosopher that there is a need for such a completion, but I cannot tell what it is. And the philosophers, and he mentions, for example, Averroes with the conjunction theory, this is for Thomas not a proper answer. This is what he calls the angustie of the great minds, the anger and the fear of the great minds, that they are thinking of those concepts, but they are not reliable. This leads us now, since I've mentioned theology, to the my final point, theology as a science. And we have to talk about theology, I guess so, because Thomas thinks himself as a theologian, but also he reflects on this role in two ways. The first is the faith-reason question, the second is the philosophy-theology question. Let me start first with the faith-reason question, and I refer to a quaestio de fide on faith, which we find in the Questiones Disputate de Veritate, question 24. And here we find a careful reflection on the epistemological status of faith within the frame of belief as a common epistemological status. So there is the main distinction is the distinction between belief and knowledge, and this applies to our everyday understanding. Yeah, and this has to do with the understanding what is the belief structure, which Thomas elaborates at this in this question. It is relying on a premise which cannot be verified or demonstrated, rather is confirmed and held by will. So in the background is a syllogism model, and when one of the promises cannot be demonstrated, but we nevertheless we held them, yeah, by an act of decision making or willing. So let me put it very easily. So when you deal with everyday knowledge, yeah, when you go, let's say again, to the bakery and say, is this healthy for me? Yeah, you don't go to the laboratory and make the test. Yeah, you just take this for granted. But this is in fact not knowledge. Yeah, but you believe that this is healthy. You actually, in fact, when you put onwards the strong criteria of what knowledge means, yeah, that we have demonstrative certainty, yeah, and insight. This you cannot apply. So the belief structure is in fact what governs our daily life. Belief is therefore, but belief, why? Because it is only confirmed and held by the will, is therefore preliminary, provisional, seeking knowledge. That means at the end then, that means we are seeking, replacing the preliminary assumption by certain knowledge. Yeah. This is also true concerning our way to know the absolute, to know God, because his essence is far beyond our intellectual capacities. And here, indeed, faith steps in, and faith comes in as a special case of belief, yeah, as a general epistemological structure based on religious convictions and revealed truth. Yeah, so we have to stick to faith unless we attain full knowledge of God in the beatific vision, when the preliminary belief is transformed into full knowledge. So, second, from this understanding, there are also consequences for theology as a science. Thomas discovers this problem pretty early in his career. So the problem arises from the traditional patristic model, which makes a claim that Christian theology is the perfection of philosophy, and therefore vera philosophia, and Thomas discovered that this model no longer holds under the influence of Aristotelian epistemology and theory of science. It was precisely the knowledge of the first principles that Aristotle called theology. So we get a second theology. And already early Christianity deliberately chose theology as a touchstone in order to give an account of truth claims of the doctrine of faith in the mode of rational speech. However, this model of Christian theology requires a redefinition in light of the rediscovered Aristotelian divine science. And more clearly than many of his contemporaries and earlier, Thomas recognizes the tensions arising from the scientific claim of theology, and so he makes the critical questions the starting point of his considerations on scientific theory. It becomes necessary to draw a line between the two divine sciences, both with regard to the definition of their subject matter and in methodological terms. That means also with regard to the organizational structure of the sciences. Thomas' answer is an important and becomes an important point of reference in this debate. For Thomas, this question again is closely linked to the determination of the possibilities of human reason. Thus, by its very nature, reason is destined to recognize truth by means of the physical and sensory things to which it is directed. The constitutive connection between sensory perception and mental cognition thus limits the transcendental openness of the intellect, which is given in its first cognitive content being, and at the same time determines the way in which the intellect recognizes the individual, not directly but reflexively, by turning to the phantasmata, the images of the imagination. In this way, the realization of the supreme cause, namely God, which is something separate from matter and the sensory imagination, also remains limited in principle, as long as our soul and thus our intellect is united with this earthly body. In the light of these possibilities, already in his commentary on Boëtius de Trinitate in his early 50s, Thomas distinguishes a twofold divine science. Firstly, a philosophical or natural theology, in which God is considered insofar as and how we can recognize him. But this theology is bound to the limits of natural reason. Thus we can recognize his existence, but not his essence in the natural way, apart from a few general characteristics such as that God is one, true and good. Therefore another theology is needed, the theology of Holy Scripture, whose subject is God and in which he is considered as he is in himself. Such a theology transcends the limits of natural reason and is therefore only possible as the theology of revelation. However, Thomas also subjects this theology of revelation to the rigor of scientific argumentation. It takes its starting point from the articles of faith, just as mathematics takes its starting points from its axioms. Scientific argumentation also forces us to give a clear account to the reasons for the validity of the principles. In his early Summa contra Gentiles, Thomas therefore speaks of a twofold truth with regard to what we can know of God. One, that the inquiry of reason is able to reach on the basis of the natural light of reason, and another that transcends all the faculties of reason and therefore descends to us in a way of revelation. But how can such a theology of revelation be science in the strict sense? Thomas' solution in the famous first quaestio of his Summa Theologiae now consists in assigning theology to those sciences that borrow their principles from other superior sciences, such as optics from geometry, which guarantees his knowledge and its evidence, and thus also ensure the scientific nature of the subordinate science. For even if in this life we cannot recognize the evidence of the mysteries of faith, stated in the Articuli Filii, which are the premises on which theological science is based, by virtue of our natural reason, they are nevertheless known to the saints who see God as he is. So Thomas just sees the scientific character of theology as assured. God is the common object of theology, of the saints, and of a theology in the mode of science. In this way, the subalternation theorem is also directed against the separation of reason from faith and of science and spirituality. However, this solution of Thomas, who seeks to anchor the scientific character of theology and the resulting epistemic status of theological arguments within the boundaries of natural reason, harbors a number of consequential problems that did not go unnoticed by his contemporaries. For the shift of the evidence of the knowledge of the saints to which theology is subalternated and owes its premises also makes its position in the order of the sciences highly problematic. The claim to be the truly first and divine science is called into question by virtue of the excellence of its subject and the outstanding way in which it deals. Thomas defends this claim by referring to the certainty of revelation as opposed to natural knowledge, which is subject to error and with reference to the special dignity of the object of knowledge. At the same time, however, Thomas must recognize the special position of theology in its relationship to other sciences. For what characterizes theology is ultimately not accessible to natural reason by itself, nor can it be proven in the same way as the principles of metaphysics and the procedural process of reason. In essence, this means the critical self-restriction of the normative claim of theology with respect to other sciences on the basis of generally applicable rules. Remember that in Aristotle, the first sciences has an ordering power with respect to the others. And I think exactly here, this is a conflict, and there Thomas' answer becomes extremely interesting, I guess. Only as a science does theology participate in the universal discourse on knowledge, but it does not determine and justify the rules of the game anymore. The consequence is the independence of the sciences, which are no longer directly subordinate to theology. Rather, all sciences, including theology, are related to each other in accordance with the scientific order, as they equally arise from man's natural desire for knowledge, which finds its fulfillment in the contemplation of God. Reason and faith are therefore just as dependent on each other as philosophy and theology, if the whole of reality is to come into view. Which is, with this solution, Thomas is by no means in the mainstream of contemporary debates about the self-understanding of theology. On the contrary, his solution was perceived as a provocation by most of his colleagues of the time, as we can see in the debates for or against Thomas, including Johannes of Samsatsa. He by no means follows his master in the prologue of his sentence commentary on the scientific character of theology. The fact that Thomas was even used as an anti-modernist herald in later centuries is one of the curiosities of the history of reception. Some words in conclusion, very short. What does Thomas have to tell us? Why is he still worthy to read? I wanted to portray Thomas Aquinas from a philosophical perspective. For him, philosophy clearly is a science, for theology has to make a choice whether it will be or not. I wanted to show and to emphasize Thomas' overall strong intellectual and scientific approach to reality and to mainly all questions and problems he is dealing with. Let me just point to the very telling prologues, not only of the Aristotelian commentaries, but to most of his writings, which reflect the subject and the method and of the respective science. But Thomas is also aware of the epistemological constraints and limitations. There is a kind of general proviso as a kind of an a priori epistemological condition. This scientific approach concerns all the topics we discuss: anthropology, ethics, theology. Thomas presents a comprehensive moral philosophy and theology as a practical science rooted in an anthropology. He developed an understanding of theology in the strict sense of the Aristotelian theory of sciences as a kind of aggiornamento for the 13th century of high actuality until now. And he presents an anthropology with his focus on the first person perspective. These are strong proposals, as far as I see, even for today's philosophical discussion at eye level. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much indeed for this really astonishing philosophical portrait of Thomas Aquinas and his thought, which in the way you presented him seems astonishingly modern and relevant for today, and who seems to offer a number of very reasonable alternatives to some tendencies in modern thought. I just mentioned some things. You highlighted his ethics, which is anti-determinist, his great emphasis on free choice, a goal-directed ethics, the scientific and cognitive optimism you talked about. All this is very rich. It will take time for us to digest these ideas, and I just open the discussion.
question concerns electio, free choice. It seems that you've outlined the necessary condition for the choice being free as indeterminacy of the potency, because the intellect represents good in a general way, and we are free to choose particular goods. But it seems to me that this is only a necessary condition of freedom, but not a sufficient one. And I often wonder about Aquinas' idea that in order for the will to make choice, it needs the previous movement of God towards that choice. For example, in Quaestio 105, of the first part of the second part of the Summa. So it seems that the second condition on freedom would be the ultimate sourcehood. One is the source of one's actions. And I'm not sure if this is really met in Aquinas in his requirement for the movement of God in his providence. So what would be your answer to this problem, Thomas's compatibilism?
Yes. Thomas is aware that there is a kind of a compatibilist element in it. So when we go through this Quaestio 6, the summary is very humble, I think, with respect to what he actually achieved. So he's really cautious and say, yeah, indeed, there is a certain element of necessity, but he defines this. That means, for example, it is less God's intervention, because he makes a claim that the divine providence means that it operates according to the nature on what the providence is operating. So in Thomas' view, at the end, for example, of the Prima Secunda, where he discusses the question of divine governance and so on, actually he clearly states that God respects the way how humans operate. And that means, as I pointed out as in this prologue, you act as agents who are in power of. They don't need an external reason or whatsoever to make them act. I think this is so important in this prologue. I see it as a kind of self-empowerment, what he sees. The problem for Thomas is indeed the necessity that nobody can reject to become happy. If this is not a necessary claim, because and he tries to, but he sees that this solution can be read in the way you presented it. That there comes in a kind of necessity in this decision-making process. But coming back to electio I think is indeed, you have to put it in the realm of practical reasoning and practical syllogism. And this is where Thomas puts it. And that practical reason and practical syllogism functions differently from a theoretical one. So it goes to the question whether we can determine the single choice. And he always underlines that this choice we have to make is about a contingent thing. Thomas' main example for contingency is a human act. And human act is always contingent. There is not a second one similar to the first one. Because even if it's the same one by object, for example, drinking a glass, I can do it 4 times. I always do it in a specific situation. The circumstances can change. So and then what determines then decision making as a practical reasoning at the end? That is indeed at the end you cannot go further and further and further, find further arguments you can implement in the way of a decision process. You have simply to make a choice. this is how he understands why electio, yeah, is the final act of the chain of practical reasoning or practical syllogism. There is no further argument to give, no further reason to give that points to the decision I have to make, whether I should drink the water now or yes, now or not. Yeah, it's just that I do this. Yeah, this is a very interesting analysis where he also compares the two sides of theoretical decision making, and this is also very interesting. Why I keep this in the modern debate. Sometimes, when in modern ethical theory, ethical decisions were also discussed under the general theory of decision making. And I have sometimes the impression that the difference between theoretical and practical reasoning, theoretical and practical decision making, is then a little bit overwrought. And I think what Thomas shows us, why I find this so important, is that he emphasizes the difference between the theoretical and the practical. And this leads to a completely different consequence. Yeah? And this is the core of ethics, dealing with this wide field of contingent actions. Yeah, the ethics, the object of ethics, is human acting, is a field of also of contingency. And this is also what I say, is that it's an ethic of from the first person perspective. It's always a question, why shall I do this or that? Yeah, and this is how I see him. And and once again, for Thomas, the determining element is only, and this is a claim in between of being theoretical or practical, that no man can avoid to be, cannot will to be happy. Yeah, so this is the only Thomas sees that there is a kind of necessity into this, but there are also when you go to this, there are also other, let's see, in modern theories. He is also open that there are other determining factors. So, like for example, habits, nature. Emotions. Yeah, so he is very much aware of this, so that this freedom is a determined freedom. So that is why I called it in one article. This is a determined freedom. But this single moment, which is irreducible. That is the main claim for Thomas, and that is the key for having an ethics or moral theory. Otherwise, we go to physics or to whatsoever, biology, to natural philosophy, to explain action or agency in this way.
Thank you for your lecture. So I'm totally convinced that we should read Thomas Aquinas today. I have one remark to your explanation about the relationship between the philosophy and theology by Aquinas. So it was very interesting. So I agree with you that it's a very original solution, maybe provocative also. But I think I should go further, and I should say that it is a very original synthesis between the conception of metaphysics by Avicenna and Neoplatonic conception of theology, because this Aquinas' solution was enabled by his adaptation of the conception of metaphysics by Avicenna, especially by his ontological or ontotheological conception of metaphysics, because for Avicenna as well for Aquinas is the subject of metaphysics is being. And God is not the subject of metaphysics, it's only the finis, it's only the goal of the metaphysics.
Indeed.
And I think, but the distinction between Aquinas and Avicenna is that for Aquinas is this adoption of this ontological conception of metaphysics only the way for his own original conception of theology, of Christian theology, because it is for Aquinas it's very important that God is not not subject of metaphysics, because he wants that God is the subject of the theology. But if we compared his natural theology and his Christian theology, there is a big difference between the both theologies, because this natural or philosophical theology begins with the creation, and this is the starting point of this theology, and the God is the goal. So we go to the God from the creation. But his own theology, his Christian theology, goes in opposite. So the direction is opposite. So the starting point is God, and in this unity. So it's I think it's you can see it in the structure, according to the structure of Summa Theologica, the God in his unity. Then through Aquinas goes through the inner Trinitarian differences in the God, and then proceeds to the procession or to the emanation of creation from the God. And then, if we go further to the second part of Summa Theologica, to his moral theology, this part of theology is conceived by Aquinas as return man, of human beings to the God, to God as his goal, as to the goal of the human life. And I think we can consider the Neoplatonic structure in this movement. So I mean remaining, procession, and return. And I think I think that this his conception, Aquinas' conception of Christian theology is inspired by this Neoplatonic conception of theology, and Aquinas know this concept of theology from Proclus, for example, from other authors. So I think it was only my remark to your explanation.
Let me just talk about two things. In the Summa Contra Gentiles, Thomas makes really clear that the two theologies have two different approaches. The natural theology starts from what we can conceive by the natural reasoning, and always goes this way that, and when we read the three books, he also makes the methodological claim, and I never found that he made confusion in this. That you can see that he always starts with philosophical arguments, and maybe at the end we find some some arguments from the theological tradition. When it comes to theology proper, you start with God and the Bible and the Revelation and so on. And you can even find this in the Summa Theologiae. Look if Thomas presents this argument as a philosopher or as a theologian. Look at the arguments at the beginning of an article. If he starts with articles from Aristotle and all, in particular from Aristotle and from philosophers, he is in the philosophical realm. And when he starts, when he wants to speak as a philosopher, for example, in the Christology part, he starts with the Bible and the fathers and so on. Even if the philosophers could help him immediately to solve the problem, he sticks to this order, and only at the end he confirms it. But concerning the Neoplatonism, this is very clear that Thomas relies on, and he needs some Neoplatonic theories, and you can see that he commented on them. So that is, and he comments on them. In particular, we have the sequence, for example, in working on the Summa and writing the commentaries. The commentaries he wrote for himself mainly. He never taught them. And they were the way of deeper understanding what was in these arguments. So you can see it, for example, in the beginning of the Prima Secundae, he was reading, he had the Nicomachean Ethics on his table. There are so many similarities. So you could really see that it was a dialogue between Aristotle and him, but you can also see when he's commenting on Boetius de Hebdomadibus, when he is commenting on the divine names, that he needs a theory of participation. Indeed, that is something you don't find in the pure ontology. Yeah, in particular, when the metaphysics is based on being and the ontological question, the theo-ontological question is not belonging to metaphysics properly. So you need a second claim. Yeah, you need a theory of participation, and this is so far. But on the other hand, what I wanted to emphasize is that there is this very strong Aristotelian claim, and I think I find Thomas, the more I read him, he's one of the strongest Aristotelians I know, much more than Andreas, for example, who is much earlier and much more relying to the kind of a Neoplatonic commentary tradition. Thomas tries to distinguish Aristotle from this tradition even, and argues that I'm more in that he seems that his solution is more in accordance with Aristotle than with his commentators. So this is one thing, but this is not a contradiction. This only shows the richness of the complexity of what he is dealing with. But in fact, with respect to philosophy, what Thomas says, and maybe let's make it also in a more fashionable way, that natural reason is bounded and limited reason, and also with respect to covering the entire reality. Yeah, you need, as in Kant, the regulative ideas. But for Thomas, the regulative ideas are not just regulative ideas; they are the ideas of theology. Yeah, this is you need. But as a philosopher, you can give, as I tried to point it out with respect to this argument on how to attain beatitude, convenient arguments. But you have to. Then the philosophy has nothing to tell anymore. What this happiness is. Philosophy cannot give us a proper answer. Then you have to turn to theology. So this is I think the way of the strategy of his answers. You also find in theoretical methods that he then opens up and say, okay, this is the limitation of philosophy. So he has I think he has a theory of reason, of human intellect, which is an intellect under limitations and the proviso of limitations. And so I could have talked, because this is a very, but on his epistemology and psychology, where you can see it, which is one of the most interesting part, anyhow, of Thomas Aquinas. But this was too much for this lecture, so I smuggled this epistemological claims into my presentation on certain things, so you noticed it. But this is so far the distinction between philosophy and theology. I think I don't know anybody who sees this difference so clearly in his time and afterwards.
Thank you. This is a fascinating discussion. Our table reservation is increasingly at risk, so I would say one longer or two short questions, and then we.
I promise to be short.
So, are there further questions?
I have a short question. So, thank you, Dr. Speer, for this very instructive lecture. My short question is, I really appreciate the title, actually. What seems to be a response to all of those who say that, the other medievalists who say that we should obligate and forget Aquinas in order to do medieval philosophy? I think it was Libera who said that we should obligate Aquinas.
I can say the Libera comes from a very specific tradition. The intellectual background, this is so far quite interesting. It brings me to my historiographical interests. Yeah, you have to understand that the Libera was still in the line to fight Gilson. Yeah, this was a Gilsonian background. Yeah, and so this has a double aspect. So this thesis that medieval philosophy is Christian philosophy, and the proper model, and the older Gilson became, thinking, for example, the stronger the claim is, Thomas Aquinas is the real model. He has the only strong philosophy on this. And so you can see that even before Vigneault, for example, they try to react to this big Gilsonian picture. He's coming back in Paris. You have to look at it. They are now back, and there's a dissertation now on Gilson, so they are really now up back into this Gilson. Then everything what Libera did, everything, was contra Thomas. I know this because my institute is called Thomas-Institut, but our research projects are all, let's see, critics or enemies or opponents of Thomas Aquinas. Meister Eckhart, Nikolaus Cusanus, Averroes, Johannes of Saint-Passon. So we are surrounding the question, by our research. But he took it really as his mainstream. I think at the end he wrote also a very nice translation and commentary on Thomas, commentary on De Anima, at least the third book. So it is then, but this was really the background, and this is a little bit different, for example, from the German background. For the starting of philosophy, our goal, I see myself in this tradition, was Clemens Wormker. Yeah, Clemens Wormker, if you know the Studien und Texte, philosophy is treated very differently, not from the one idea, though is Christian philosophy and is Thomas Aquinas, but it is it equals the sciences at this time. So imagine that Wormker already published editions on Arabic texts, Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Vitello, and so on, Jewish authors in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And so this is a different starting point, having medieval philosophy as part of a huge tradition of philosophy equals episteme. So this closeness, philosophy being close to the history of the sciences. And then even Thomas has then a different place of understanding. But I know this in particular because my predecessor Jan Arzen, he was a little bit in this anti-Gilson thing. So he wanted to present his own alternative. So you have then Gilson, and then we have the Libera, and then we have Jan Arzen with the transcendental philosophy. So this is how to explain this, and so this is interesting to understand the conceptions behind historiographical models.
Thank you.